Before we turn to the promised panel discussion, I'd like to proffer a warm thanks to the Edwin Morgan Trust and the Centre for Poetic Innovation at the Universities of Dundee and St Andrews for making this event possible. Many of you will be familiar with the information already available about the awards on the Morgan Trust website. But just in case, we're popping a refresher link into the chat bar kind of in the next few minutes so that you can keep it bookmarked. I keep thinking that it's important to keep thanking people, and it's sort of a sense that I have. Such an event wouldn't be possible without the people that I've already thanked, but also such an event would not be possible without the panel in front of you. I'm really happy to be here with these two brilliant poets with whose work you should be very familiar, and if not, do check them out before you apply for the Morgan Award 2022. But I'm really happy to be here with Alycia, Pirmohamed, who I'm just going to willfully steal a bio. I don't think this counts as plagiarism, right? It's found poetry. She's a Canadian poet based in Scotland, author of Hinge and Faces That Fed the Wind, and the collaborative lyric essay Second Memory, and also co-founder of what is now called the Scottish BPOC Writers Network, co-organizer of Ledbury Poetry Critics Programme, and much more. In 2020, she was awarded the Edwin Morgan Poetry Award and is reading for this year's award. So it's wonderful to have you here, Alycia. Also to introduce and embarrass Colin Hurd, poet and lecturer at Glasgow. So we've got an Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dundee triangle, whose books, volumes include Two OK, Glove Box, Click and Collect, Swamp Kiss, you name it. He's also the editor of the Edwin Morgan Centenary Collection. You can see a theme here, perhaps, and co-editor with Sam Small of 2-volume All Becomes Art, and many more. So hi, Alycia. Hi, Colin. I thought we might start with a bit of a bricolage, which is to say, I guess, a bit of a challenge. So on the event page, the first and last questions that this event poses are all about the idea of a portfolio. How do I select which poems should be in the collection? How do I make sure that my selected poems speak to each other? It's a difficult thing. I think we all know, sitting in a sea of drafts and pages and drafts and pages, trying to work out how to whittle things down to, well, in this case, it's 10 poems, a maximum of 12 pages, or if spoken aloud or video recorded, 12 minutes, right? So 10-12 ratio. And in any of the English variant, Scots and Gaelic as various language options. So it's a language process, a concrete process, a visual process, a vocal process, and a deeply kind of emotional process, I think. We've got a couple of telegrams about this. One from the amazing Maria Fusco, who's one of the Morgan Awards nomination committee. And I'm not going to try and share my screen at this point, but hopefully in the editing process, a slide will miraculously appear. Maria has sort of written to say that ordering expanded forms of poetry, such as the concrete or the visual, is a spatial and a temporal process. So her advice to you all here tonight is to print it out, the work out, lay it on the floor. I know I use a wall and blue tack, which is not good for the paint. Spend some time walking it, reading it out loud as you do. And we have another longer telegram from the amazing Nadine Aisha Jassat, a part of which also says, ask yourself to get to the heart of your collection, like to get to the heart of your collection or what you want to say with it. Look at the poems, their placing, their titles, and their ordering to help you translate that to your readers. And she also says, on a practical note, print all your poems out and really look at them in person. So it's a face-to-face interaction with the poems. Group them by themes, learn about yourself and your work by reading the pages, and placing them on your bedroom, kitchen, living room floor. It's a wonderful way to play and see the different ways you could structure the collection and just how big an impact placement can have, right? So we've got 2 other readers for this year's award giving the same advice and wishing everybody good luck. So I think there's a thread running through this. And I think this might be similar irrespective of the type of the poetry that each of us write, because I know that we're 3 very different poets speaking tonight, concrete, innovative, performance, film poetry, lyric poetry, collaborative work. I know I read my stuff aloud to myself, sort of like a mad person, when I'm putting together sequences in order to work out how it really feels on the tongue, the logic of that. But is this something that you both think about as well when you're pulling together a collection? Is this something that you'd give as sort of prime advice to people thinking of applying for this year's Morgan Awards?
And I'll start, and then Colin, just jump in if you have anything to add. And then kind of responding to what Maria and Nadine have said, I agree that I think the whole idea of printing it out or blue tacking it is kind of the process of thinking about the portfolio holistically rather than just single poems. So everybody is probably, they have their own process. My process as a poet is I tend to write a poem as a singular piece, and that piece kind of exists on its own for a long time. And it's interesting because I'm putting together, or I have just put together my first collection, my first full-length collections manuscript. And so I'm starting to think about the echoes between the pieces. So no longer is a piece that was originally created as a singular poem, no longer can it exist that way that it was processed to be. So I have to start thinking about how does this poem echo with what's right next to it? How does it echo with something that comes a few pages later? How does it echo with the last poem in the collection? And that means that suddenly some words have to change in the poem because some of the threads are not apparent enough. Some of the repetitions don't feel deliberate enough. Some of the echoes so I could capitalize on some of the echoes a little bit more. So it's kind of this idea of changing in my particular process, and you might be different, you might always be thinking in terms of projects, like in terms of like several poems together. But in my process, I have to go from thinking of a poem as it exists on its own, perhaps in an online journal, on a page that you just click and it's that poem by itself, and starting to think about how is the narrative working with the poem right next to it, and how is that thread continuing throughout the portfolio. And I do think printing it out, or if you're not printing it out, looking at them like on Word in a tiled format can really help, even just thinking about what structures visually you have next to each other. I noticed that a lot of my poems use couplets. So do I have like just a huge chunk of couplets and then one poem that's a block? Like how am I playing visually with the structure as well? And what are the echoes there? So yeah, maybe I'll pause there for a minute.
Yes, I couldn't agree more with sort of what everyone said around the importance of kind of paying attention to the kind of individual work in relation to a kind of sense of different kind of roots around or through or between poems. I love Alycia's kind of term echoes. I think there are lots of other kind of ways of thinking about that as well. Like I quite often think of kind of attraction, like how poems kind of almost like magnetically kind of attract each other. And that can be something in the language. Like I loved Heather's opening kind of hearth and heart. And sometimes there can just be those moments where there are kind of phrases or words that just kind of seem to form a kind of tension or attraction. sometimes resistance also. Like, it can be that they're kind of, you know, polarizing rather than attracting kind of poems together. And that can be a really interesting kind of dynamic of a collection to explore. I have a kind of like the best example I can think of this was kind of working with a student on their dissertation, and they'd written a series of really beautiful poems across a semester, and their plan was to kind of present these poems in the chronological order in which they were written, and it was a sort of time-based thing because it was a semester of work, and they kind of tracked a journey that they'd been on in terms of their mental health. And it worked as a collection in this chronological way. But in one of our last meetings, I kind of encouraged them to do exactly this thing of printing the poems out and looking at them and thinking about them in terms of these kinds of ideas of the echoes and attractions and kind of things that they hadn't expected to find in the poems that maybe linked them, connected them, and things like that. And they ended up finding this amazing kind of idea of sort of connectivity in the poems, which some of the poems had been written in somewhere that they had a lot of Wi-Fi, and some of the poems had been written in somewhere where they had no Wi-Fi. And they ended up just using this kind of idea of connectivity to structure the whole collection. So they had a kind of section of the collection that was 1 bar of connectivity going up to a section of the collection that was 5 bars. And they started thinking of it really kind of metaphorically in terms of how connected the poems were, how connected the language was in the poems. And it really elevated and made the collection say a lot more than it would have in the kind of chronological sequence.
So there's something there about the sort of editing the poems kind of in their kind of singular units, but then how a poem changes and shifts as you allow it to articulate itself, right? Alongside its other poems and placing them out and walking them. I love that idea of just walking the poetry. Can really bring those lines out in different ways, right? And so, yeah, I wondered if either of you had any further thoughts about that. I know that we're also edging towards the moment where there will be a short 5-minute break in this panel, but just a few comments before we break for 5 minutes.
I just have one more tiny thought maybe, which is if you're doing like I do think it's important, like the printing out and walking around it is lovely, but not always necessarily possible for everyone or necessarily desirable for everyone's aesthetic. And it is possible to think about in a similar way to kind of the sort of slippage between different windows or screens online, and whether you kind of open them all up as different files and then kind of skip between them in a digital way, that might also produce really interesting results. It's just a slightly different way of thinking about it.
I can add a thought really quickly that's responding to something Colin said earlier about like the temporal movement of the poems, or writing them or placing them in order. And one thing that I found really interesting is in my manuscript, a poem that was written in 2016 that I thought I just didn't have any relationship to anymore had new resonance when I put it next to newer poems. So I think that there's something really interesting about, you know, you might feel really connected to new work because it feels like you right now, but going back and seeing some of the things that you've created in the past and kind of placing them next to each other can make you re-look at your poems in a new way. Even if you don't end up either putting either of those in the portfolio or only one of them in the portfolio, it can make certain things stand out that you never would have connected otherwise. And that's like just based on the time of writing, really.
So that's, yeah, time of writing I love, and then the time of editing. And since we're thinking about time, we are now in this event going to take a 5-minute break and resume a comfort break and resume at 30 minutes past the hour. So thank you all. And we will see you again very, very soon. Welcome back. This is really exciting. I didn't think I've ever had a break like this in an event of this sort, and what it's allowed is for me to work out and to consolidate my thinking, even around the conversations that we've had. And what I found amazing is that this idea of the music and the rhythm of the poems really came out for me just in those 5 minutes. I wondered then, because you both know, and many of us here will know, that the awards this year are asking for fewer poems than the original really demanding quantity of poems that were asked for. So just to reiterate, it's 10 poems up to 12 pages or 12 minutes. And they're asking for digital submissions for page poetry, sound or video poems, so poem films in effect. And I wondered, Colin or Alycia, if you had any thoughts about that, because I mean, Morgan worked across so many media in his work, and we're kind of familiar with the page poems, but he was a visual poet, a concrete poet. He read the work. I wondered if you had any thoughts about the idea of presenting a collection of work in an alternate format. And I feel awkward even calling it an alternate format, because those are two ways in which I think we all think about poetry. It's just something that a kind of a poetry award doesn't seem to necessarily kind of speak to so much until now, perhaps.
I'll go and then I'll pass over to Alycia. I really, so I think it's really, really exciting. And I think a lot of the same sort of principles maybe apply in terms of somehow creating that sort of outside perspective and being able to sort of look at the work from outside and think about how you might kind of structure and order and present, and how the work speaks in the way you want it to speak, whether it's, you know, whether it's a performance or a video work. And maybe also think about, you know, possibly just because we've just been on a pause, but think about, you know, questions of pause, questions of yeah, whether like where the kind of viewer or listener gains kind of perspective on and access to the sound file or the video. There's a performance poet who isn't very well known at all, called Jason Gaver, whose work I'm really interested in, and he unfortunately died of AIDS, but his work, he passed away when he was 33, I think, and but he produced all these amazing performances, and he often printed books of his performances as well. But what I thought was interesting about his work is he included, as part of the work, the audience kind of reactions. So he would actually, I mean, he actually did make kind of printed publications of his performances, but he included within that the kind of heckles and kind of audience reactions as a kind of part of the text of his poems. And whether you're doing a sound file or whether you're doing something like that, I think it's just really interesting in terms of emphasis and in terms of kind of where the poem is, you know, whether the poem is in the actual event of the performance or, you know, just kind of thinking about the kind of porousness and the possibilities and opportunities of that, kind of not quite knowing where the poem is.
I would totally agree. I think it's really exciting. I think having an award like this opening up to all these different kind of forms or interdisciplinary forms, or, you know, collaborative, like different kinds of like genres coming together. I think that it is really exciting because it means that there's just going to be more of everything. And I think that's really important when we think about the process of gatekeeping in the industry, or the way poetry has been, you know, even taught or portrayed, or the kind of way that we've encountered it. We, of course, being like, for me, and when I think about, you know, I'm in like living in the Western world and encountering it in like an educational environment, and there's a canon that I'm supposed to be reading and supposed to know. But I think that when we open up the doors and invite more people to write in the way that suits their writing and their ideas, that is really exciting, and that's what we need more of. And it just is a way to invite more people into this process. So that's my thought on opening the awards up. I think it's great. I think it's amazing. But I also think that now, because a lot this award is doing that, and I've seen it happening in a lot more like publications or performances in general. I think we're seeing that artists actually are working in different modes all the time anyway. And a lot of my favorite artists are performers, like you mentioned Edwin Morgan, and then Banu Kapil, one of my favorite poets, is also always working like within a bodily space. And poetry is not just on the page for that poet. And so I think that it also works almost as a metaphor, like these different forms become metaphors of each other or metaphors of the themes or the things that we're trying to express. And it just creates a richness. So I think that there is, I think you were right, Heather, when you said we kind of are always encountering poetry in all these different ways through all these different senses. And I think a lot of artists, when you really think about it, are constantly playing within those things, even if they're, you know, the collections you read end up being more what we're used to seeing generally. But yeah, our experiences of poetry are all of these things, which is really great.
Yeah, so I think one of the things turning towards our kind of comrades in the Zoom room is reminding me of something, Colin, that you said really early on before we had a break, which was about allowing the medium in which you write, or the multiple media you cross when you're writing, and the spaces and the times of when you're writing, to help infiltrate and form and reform the work. So it's this sort of this informative process of letting the work mold your molding of it, right? And that is a really wonderful way of thinking also across media, as kind of Alycia was sort of speaking about, that sort of interweaving, but to allow the work to ask questions back of you, I think is also one of those kind of beautiful ways in which editing can take place. But it involves also then giving something up to the collection, not being scared to give something up to the poetry. With that, if we were sort of talking to people that are putting together poems or sitting amongst the sea of drafts, whether it's a digital sea, an auditory sea, or a page-based sea, sitting amongst a sea of drafts, some advice about how to navigate that sea with maximal confidence. Any thoughts there? Bringing together, thinking about maybe form and formatting.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. But I'm not sure that I think that kind of navigational metaphor is a really interesting one. And I'm not sure that it needs to necessarily be fully confident navigation on the part of the writer. I actually think having that kind of openness and that room for kind of error and kind of erring and being kind of carried away by currents might be really, that I feel like that will also does also translate to the reader when they encounter a text in really pleasurable ways, and can really open up the possibility of different routes for them through a collection. Because even though we put such care and attention and effort into ordering poems, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's exactly how poems get read. You know, often readers of poetry will read through the kind of the order that they're presented in, and then read back to poems that particularly kind of attracted them, or for whatever reason. And so I think poetry as a form does often resist a kind of a one navigational route, and has these possibilities of kind of currents, and also kind of interruption, and I really love collections where there are, or series of sequences of poems where there are moments that actually don't like that feel like outliers, that feel like they suddenly, like I can't remember if this was during the Zoom or before the Zoom, but we had this conversation. There was a kind of question of a window popping up, and I actually quite love the idea of a poetry collection where you suddenly get a pop-up, something really unexpected. So I think, yeah, that kind of, it's important to leave room, I think, for that sort of openness and not knowing, for that kind of sense of a readerly discovery and a readerly pleasure in the text.
I think that's such a great comment, such a great way to put it, like the pop-up in the poetry book. I really like that. And some of the words that you're using, I think like rupture, I think is really important, because I think that in poetry, you always want there to be sort of this, there's an expectation, but you also want the surprise to be there too. You want to be surprised and moved by the work. And I think a lot of that comes to the process of creating pattern and then subverting pattern. I think that can be so effective if when it's intentionally done, because you're deliberately establishing something in the work, and then when you subvert it, it creates such a tension to the rupturing there, and it creates a sense of surprise. And of course, the constant kind of tension there, the constant question is, how do you make it a surprise, but also something that you've deliberately done, and so that it's a pop-up or it's an outlier, but it doesn't pull us away. It actually brings us further in. And that, I think that's something that you just, as long as you're thinking about it, it'll come through in the work. So like not to be afraid of having an outlier, but actually embracing the rupture, or embracing the fact that, you've created a pattern and now you're like pulling it away from us. So I think that's quite interesting. And it also creates maybe that movement when you're reading several poems by one author, whether they're in the way they're presented in the collection or just several different poems. I think there always can be that moment of breaking pattern, which is an exciting thing, I think.
That's super exciting. This is wonderful, because it's providing this event is providing its own kind of formal structure in all sorts of exciting ways to break pattern. We're gonna kind of now move to some of the questions that are being asked, and I'm gonna pass the mic and a spotlight over to Iona, who I think is going to take over in terms of questions.
Yeah, hello. So I believe I'm here in the role of poet who is applying to the award. And also I think personally in the role of a poet who works across the genres, across the forms offered, who writes for the page, who writes for performance, and who writes for sound. So my question is, while the opening up of the forms available is potentially is freeing, it's also potentially restricting for people who write across different disciplines. So how would you suggest that a cross-genre poet, a poet who enjoys working in all three forms, decide which one would be the best one to choose for the application, which one would best represent their work?
This kind of chimes a little bit with B's question as well in the chat, I think, which is with the new format, you can submit via audio and video, but wondering if it's possible to submit effectively a transcript with an audio file, which I think is not the case in the awards. So the media are quite siloed because there is a sense in the awards that really they want to support people that are working quite intensely or presenting the poetry, the portfolio quite intensely in a single yet multiple given medium, right? So B, I hope that helps answer your question, but also to kind of, it does articulate a little bit with Iona's as well. So I'd like to then gift this to Colin and Alycia.
I probably don't have a particularly useful answer for you in terms of sort of how you would go about selecting that. I think that will be, so for people who work across different media, but also people who just have different poems to select from and different kind of strands to their work, I think we'll both be faced rather than phased with that same challenge of choosing which work to submit. And it is a really hard thing. You never, people say things like, oh, just choose your best work. But I mean, I have no idea what my best work is. And I often, until I kind of read poems to audiences or publish them, I have no idea which poems will resonate with people. And often the poems that people say resonate with them, I'm not entirely sure whether they really are the poems, that they're the poems that they remember. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the ones that people, actually have got the most from. So it is a really difficult question. And I think at a certain point, you probably just have to go with your gut instinct of the work that really excites you. And it is really, prizes are wonderful. Prizes are a great thing to support work and to nurture talent. They're not everything though. And what is everything really is you being excited by your own work and kind of confident in your own work and having a sense of what you want to achieve with your writing. My favorite, I feel pretty confident to say pretty much all my favorite writers have never won prizes. Like a lot of my favorite writers have never won prizes. Sorry, Alycia is one of my favorite writers who has won a prize. But there are so many poets who have never won prizes who are amazing writers. So the fundamental thing is you being confident and excited by your work and submitting the work that excites you the most, and then just allowing what will happen will happen.
Just to jump right, because it's completely related, is one of the really amazing changes this year. I mean, it was always in the award, but I think it's more prominent now, is that it's about developing your craft. And that's such a big aspect of it. And I guess, yeah, go with your gut instinct of what excites you. I think that's the best advice. And then thinking about, what do you want to develop? Like, what is it that you want to take forward? With all the resources that the award might provide, because it is, it's all about the potential of what you have and growing. I think that's one of the really exciting things about what the award is emphasizing this year.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the other thing about this sort of submission is, if you submit something that in effect is sort of created with the form that the award is asking for in mind, whilst also then sort of coming away from that and becoming something that is your work, that you're simply kind of giving out into the world and also to the awards. That's the way that you can kind of gain a poetic sense of how kind of something is, I suppose, sticking, like if it becomes sticky. So for those of you who are swithering, I suppose, between audio, if you're both a page poet and a performance poet, try playing around with both and then see what the particular conjuncture you're in at that moment before submission. See which one, like, go with gut feeling, I think. See which one works, because then what you give will be a gift. And then there won't be that sort of anxiety, kind of award-facing anxiety, and it will be rather about development, like Alycia was saying. And then that's one of the other amazing things about what the award is fostering this year. I have my eye on the clock, but thinking on a slightly more granular but this is also about gut feeling. We've had a couple of questions about presentation of poetry. So this is the page poets, I suppose, but equally could apply for the other media. How much latitude about font? I suppose if we translated this into video, how much would one want to have kind of image, sound, and text? I suppose my answer is, look at how many different media Morgan worked towards and across, and the concrete stuff, and realize that is the remit. So so you have absolute control of your page as a poet. I wonder, Colin, Alycia, if you have any tips on editing, like interaction with the space, so the 12 minutes or the 12 pages.
I can't tell if you're unmuting, Colin, or if I should just go. Okay. I think that in terms of the page itself, because it's electronic submission, especially, I think there's a lot of play and freedom on the page. in editing anthologies and things that I've done in the past, it's really interesting to get electronic submissions and then have to portray them in a physical format, because then you start to realize, okay, like when you're putting a lot of different people's work together, a lot of different forms together, some pages have to go landscape, some things have to be over 2 pages, or some things, as try as you might, can never be replicated on the print. But I think because this year, so last year, or in 2020, when I submitted my manuscript, it was printed, but I think this year, because it's electronic, there's so much opportunity there to play with space. And I think that's another great thing about online publications. And then again, having like video formats and audio formats, there's so much opportunity. So I think, yeah, freedom is in this case, the layout of the page just is an exciting place to play with. And then in terms of presentation of a portfolio, I feel like I don't, in terms of having like cover pages or whatever else, or in terms of font, I think if it's important to you, that's what you should present. But I don't think we would, I mean, this is a discussion you would have as a panel, of course, but I don't think we would look at it differently if you didn't include a cover page, for example, and someone else did. So I think it's all about kind of like the poem and how a poem is playing with space, because I did see some details about kind of more logistical stuff in the chat too.
Yeah, and on that, I sort of prompted by the logistical question. I kind of just looked up, and the description on the website is really wonderful, actually. So it says, the Edwin Morgan Poetry Award places no restrictions on the definition or form or look of a poem. And I think that's really, like that is such an opportunity to you as poets looking to submit to this award, to really consider all the different affordances and opportunities of the form that you're working in. And I always encourage people to consider, so this is a portfolio or a manuscript of 10 poems, and just think of what that with or there's also the 12 pages, isn't there? But just think about what the opportunities of that are, and how you can really welcome the kind of reader in, or provide them a kind of exit point, or whether there's kind of different levels on which you can kind of interact with the reader within that space that you're being allowed for your PDF, or indeed if it's video work or sound work. So really just using those conventions, so not feeling like there are conventions that you have to adhere to, but actually thinking about how you can create use conventions, or use the kind of affordances of the form to really create the sort of environment you want for your work. And you can really do so much in terms of how it gets read. I'm very interested in sort of what people call like kind of paratext. So all the kind of like furniture of a book or a publication or a manuscript, whether you have kind of forwards, afterwards, I mean, I don't think that's really part of this Edwin Morgan submission, but there's no reason why you can think of a poem in terms of a kind of like introduction to a collection, or a kind of afterword to a collection, or kind of notes or marginalia. All of those things are kind of part of what the space of the PDF might allow.
I see you're nodding, Alycia. I like I love the idea of paratext as furniture. That's something's going on there for me. Yeah. So we are coming to a close, and I think we've managed to address in ways direct and oblique all of the questions in the chat. So for now, I would like to really thank Iona, and you can see that I'm probably pointing to the wrong side of the screen. You can see in the chat that all of the relevant links to the awards pages have come up in the chat. There is a quick question from B actually that I will address. Identifying elements as in name, if identifying elements qua name rather than face and body, I think, but equally that applies to any form of don't edit yourself out of your work. Just don't put your name at the top of your submission. I think that's what identifying elements mean. But just as it seems that things are getting interesting, because that is a form of paratext, of course, that identifying element, the name at the top of the page, marking the page. Time seems to be running away with us. So I'd like to thank you all for being here, and to thank Colin and Alycia, Kyra, Luca, and this is the moment where I'm Cheryl and Iona, for making this event possible and taking on for a moment the voice of the Morgan Trusts and the Poetry Awards 2022. Thank you all for attending and good luck with it all. May this year's award bring the sort of poetry that is dream haunting, on the subject of which it seems right to end with a few lines from the old man himself. What was astonishing in the dream was I could recite whole stanzas of his poetry off by heart. Lines, images flew from my tongue. I remembered it all, astonishing myself, even as I slept. Thank you all again. Good night, wishing you all sweetest of poetic dreams.